Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Olivia Saya, the Public Programs Coordinator at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm delighted to have you join us online this evening for a conversation about the legacy of a trailblazing 18th century doctor who was ahead of her times. At the MHS, we're committed to bringing people together with interesting and thought-provoking programs. We host a variety of events that delve into the complexities of history and encourage people to share their observations, interpretations, and ideas. And we're able to do so because of the support provided by friends like you. You can learn more about our programs and how to support us at masshist.org. And this evening, I'm honored to welcome author Susan Wilson and former president of the Dimock Community Health Center, Jackie Jenkins-Scott. Susan Wilson is a widely respected photographer, author, and public historian who has written and lectured about Boston history for the past decades. She is the official house historian of the Omni Parker House. And Jackie Jenkins-Scott currently serves as the interim president of Roxbury Community College. Previously, she was the president of Wheelock College for over 12 years and head of the Dimock Center. And now I invite you to sit back and enjoy the conversation as our speakers discuss Dr. Susan Dimock's legacy in medical, women's, and world history.
Thank you, Olivia. We're delighted to be here. And Susan, we're going to have fun tonight.
Oh, yeah. So I thought that maybe it would make sense for me just to read from the intro to the book for anyone who possibly doesn't know about Susan Dimock, and then we'll get into more details. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. It's
okay.
Great.
So this is from the book, Women and Children First. Okay. In 19th century America, it was commonly assumed that the words woman and doctor did not belong in the same sentence. It was acceptable, of course, for any woman to be treated by a doctor, especially by an upstanding white male doctor from a respectable white family. But the idea of a woman doctor was deemed by many to lie somewhere between unfathomable and repugnant. Women's place, it was argued, was in the home, where mothers and daughters could certainly bandage small wounds or administer hot compresses for family members. These were respectable middle and upper class women, a stark contrast to those improper ladies who pursued professional careers and were probably unsexed, manly, or perhaps even bearded. Yes, those are all words that were used for women who pursued professional careers. Then along came Susan Dimock, a young North Carolinian who dreamed of becoming a doctor, then grew up to practice medicine in late 19th century Boston. Dimock was not the first American woman to battle a patriarchal medical establishment, but in the 1870s, she was arguably the best educated, most skilled woman surgeon in the nation, as well as living proof that a woman could be competent, smart, womanly, lovely, and kind, all in the same package. As resident physician and chief surgeon at the New England Hospital for Women and Children, the second hospital in the U.S. run by women and for women, Dr. Dimock impressed all who watched her work. A colleague observed that, quote, anyone who saw Dr. Dimock at the operating table, where she was as calm and self-possessed as in the morning visit, who watched the extreme delicacy and skill with which she handled the tools and the loving care with which she guarded the sensibilities of the patient, must have recognized the eternal fitness of things and seen that she was in her rightful place. This ambitious biography, the first to chronicle the doctor's entire life journey, aspires to give Susan Dimock her equally rightful place in medical, women's, and world history. Throughout the book, Dimock's life reads like an adventure story, from recoiling at slave auctions and witnessing Civil War battles, to escaping her fire-engulfed southern hometown, then finding her place among Boston's most enterprising women. She studied medicine in Zurich and Vienna, hiked the Swiss Alps, executed complex surgeries, and trained America's first professional nurses, ultimately inspiring a new generation of female surgeons. It's no surprise that a prestigious Viennese medical professor, when asked for advice to aspiring young doctors, replied simply, "Make yourself to be like Miss Dimock." In 1860, there were some 55,000 men and only 300 women practicing medicine in the United States. Today, more than 50% of the nation's medical students are women. Dr. Susan Dimock, with her patience, persistence, empathy, and excellence, was a fascinating and trailblazing figure in the all too long battle from there to here. As such, she is both a charismatic 19th century role model and a thoroughly modern woman for a 21st century reader. This is her story. That's the intro.
Amazing. Amazing. You know, as you were reading that, I was thinking we've come so far and we've not come far enough. It's those words could be spoken today. So you know, hats off to Susan Dimock for her courageous, adventurous life that has inspired so many. You know, when I came to Dimock Community Health Center in 1983, it was because of Susan Dimock and Dr. Zach, as she was called, and the other women who started. You know, Dimock was in bankruptcy, and we had a receiver, and I was hired. And I think the plan was that I was supposed to just, you know, put the place to bed. And when I walked on the campus, Susan, I just felt something in my spirit that said, the women who started this place, we had those incredible buildings, Dimock sits up on a hill, would be turning over in their grave if we did what the appraiser said, which the appraiser said, these buildings are worth nothing, tear them down, salt it, and 15 years from now, he didn't give a number, but the idea was that this would make great condos or something, because on a great clear day, you literally can see downtown Boston from Dimock. So that's how, I got my start at Dimock, and I met you shortly thereafter. And then we didn't see each other for what, 10 years or 15 years?
Something like that. Something like that. I did want to say one thing. Olivia, could you show the picture of the Z building? Because this is an important link between the past and the present. Back in 1872, nope, that's the grave. Yeah, that's it. This building there it is. Yep. This building, when Susan Dimock became the resident physician at the New England Hospital for Women and Children in 1872, this was the building that she worked in. This was the hospital building. And this, Jackie, you told me this was one of the buildings, this great, wonderful, high Victorian building that they were going to tear down, that make into a parking lot.
They were going to tear it down. That was the recommendation of the appraiser.
Exactly.
The receiver had gotten the whole campus appraised. Dimock sits on about 10 acres of land and 8 historic buildings. And he said, tear them all down. They were worth no money. A quick story, Susan.
Yeah.
When I first came, I didn't know anything about historic preservation. And I think that's one reason how I met you, in part. I didn't know anything about historic preservation, but what I knew was in my spirit was, we have to make sure nobody can come in and tear these buildings down.
Right.
And so somehow I got connected with Historic Boston and a guy named Stan Smith. I don't know if you remember Stan.
Oh, Smith. I remember Stan well. Yep.
And he actually helped me to get Dimock listed on the National Register of Historic Places and on the Massachusetts Register. So those buildings will be there for a very long time.
Well, I wanted to add, Jackie, I wanted to add something that is the Z building, and it's still there today. And today it's in the midst of a renovation.
Oh,
I think the last number I heard was $18 million. Someone will correct me, was the goal. And this is going to become the clinical stabilization service for men, which is a big deal that men will be able to, who are in recovery will be able to stay there for long periods as long as it takes them to recover. So it's there it is. The same building that Susan worked in is
so
being used to help
exactly.
underserved people in the community today.
Was the
Um,
very first renovation project that we had, because when I arrived at Dimock in 1983, that building was leaking, as were so many buildings. So the first project was to get the roof replaced, and we ended up securing $500,000 is what it cost in the late 80s to replace the roof. We understand it has 100 or 50-year roof on it now. So like I said, it's hard to believe that, 20 some years later. But that was our very first renovation project on the campus. And it's a beautiful building for those
exquisite.
in the audience. Just go up and walk around Dimock. Those buildings are incredible.
Oh, I just wanted to mention about the building. The architects who built it, who designed it, were Cummings and Sears. And there are various in Boston history combinations of people. But Sears went on a couple of decades later to create something for Mrs. Gardner. That would be the Gardner Museum, Mrs. Gardner's Fenway
Really?
Palace.
Wow,
Yes.
I didn't know that.
So we have a prestigious guy involved. Also, for frame of reference, I wanted to mention the um, the New England Hospital started in back in 1862, which is right in the middle of the Civil War. The first 10 years, they were actually in downtown Boston, near where Charles Playhouse, Blue Man Group is. Um,
Oh,
and then they were so successful that they bought this beautiful land out in Roxbury where there was fresh air and trees and light, and it wasn't like dirty old
at
downtown
that
Boston.
time, Roxbury was the country.
Oh, absolutely. Gorgeous. And they knew that fresh air and light was very important. And this was the New England Hospital for Women and Children, which was the second hospital in the United States after the Blackwell sisters in New York, where women doctors treated women patients. It was a hospital up until 1969, and basically it ended its life as a hospital. The essence, it's long and complicated, but it had been in decline for many
Yeah.
years.
Well, once
Partly,
they started letting women in medical school and,
exactly,
that's
exactly. I mean, part of the reason was it was a victim of its own success, because when it started, women couldn't get into medical schools. Um, uh, I mean, Susan Dimock was one of the many people who applied to Harvard. She applied to get into Harvard Medical College back in 1867, and she was turned away, even though we know as a fact that she was more qualified than most, if not all, of the guys who were let in that year. And do you know when Harvard started admit? She was turned away for her
40s.
gender.
Was it
What,
during the 40s?
1945.
I thought so, in the 40s.
Yeah. So if Susan had waited until she was 98,
She would have.
she could have applied to Harvard Medical School.
That's outrageous. That's outrageous. So maybe we should tell our audience how you and I met and how we got started. A long, wonderful, wonderful relationship. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So this started 3 decades ago. So it's hard to believe since we're both only 39.
That's right.
But
Oh,
anyway,
but you can tell with my gray hair now, Susan.
it was 3 decades ago. I used to write history columns for the Boston Globe. I did history columns for 9 years. The two major columns I did on a monthly basis, one was called Sights and Insights, which became a book. And I had another one in the City Weekly called History Notebook. And this started out as a story in History Notebook. And
Mm,
basically, I would look for something, kind of a this day in history type thing. And I would look through old newspapers looking for interesting stories that happened. And I was down at the Boston Public Library reading through some old newspapers. This is pre-digital, and reading about this awful, awful shipwreck that happened and how upset people in Boston were. And I kept seeing this name over and over again. Susan Dimock, we think she's a strong swimmer, she's going to survive. And then, oh no, Susan Dimock, her body's been found and she's died. And people were very upset. So I went, okay, this is a story. I said, wait a sec, I've heard that name before. And of course, I'd heard of the Dimock Community Health Center, which today is called the Dimock Center. So I began doing research. I called the Dimock Community Health Center. I met you and an incredible staff of wonderful people. And we started digging. And one of the things we discovered that I discovered from the newspaper was that she was buried at Forest Hills Cemetery in Jamaica Plain. And you guys didn't even know that you owned a lot at Forest Hill Cemetery because Susan was there and so was the founder of the hospital, Dr. Zach. And so you didn't know you owned something there. And then the people at the cemetery, you know how prestigious old cemeteries always have maps of the famous people there. They went, Susan Dimock, Dr. Zakshevska, who are they? So they didn't know they were famous. So we became this triumvirate between Forest Hills, the Dimock Center, and me and my buddies in the historic community, and began digging. And so the story came out in the Globe. People love the story, but we also discovered in that lot of that belonged to the New England Hospital and the Dimock Center that Susan's grave was disintegrating. And Olivia, if you could pull up that the photo of the two graves, that would be great. And essentially what had happened was when Susan died in 1875, they carved her grave. Nope, that's gold coin. Oh, there it is. Okay. Here's the grave on the left. This is what it looked like. And you can't really tell the disrepair, but it was almost completely illegible. It had been made from a beautiful kind of marble that was very popular in the late 19th century, but that had not anticipated acid rain. And so much of it was illegible. And we got a woman who I met in the Historic Burying Grounds Initiative, Carol Driscoll, to come and check out to see if we could fix it and make it more legible. And she said, no, this is just going to keep going. It's just going to keep melting away. So we all decided that rather than repair it, that we would replace it. And so Jackie and I created the Dimock Heritage Fund, and we fundraised and told Susan Dimock's story for a year or more, collected money, had Carol recreate this in granite. So the stone there today, even though it looks old, is a total recreation of the original stone. We did this with permission of the only cousin, a distant cousin we could find of Susan's, who was living in Virginia at the time. And then we had this wonderful event where I think something like 100 people showed up, and we had a walking tour of famous 19th century women at Forest Hill Cemetery. And we had people from 5 to 85 and people who were mobile and not mobile. We hired a bus to bring the people who couldn't do it. It was just people from all over the place. It was wonderful. And then Jackie and I started doing speaking. And here's a picture of Jackie.
Raise the money, Susan.
Oh yeah, we got the money together, and then so here's Jackie and I 30 years ago. Who are they?
Look at the hair.
Yeah, look at our hair. Anyway, so I think this was a talk we gave at the Boston Athenaeum, and we talked in a variety of places, and basically spread the word about the past and the present of this important medical and healthcare facility. So that's what we did, and that's what's happened 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So should we jump ahead? What do you want to do, Jackie?
Jump ahead. Ahead. So now, how did you end up writing this book?
Okay, so fast forward.
Great book, by the way, Susan.
Thank you.
Susan and I had, for the audience, Susan and I had lunch a few weeks ago, and I said, Susan, this book needs to be turned into a movie.
So anyone with connections in the world of movies, please contact us. It is a great movie, or would be. Anyway, so fast forward 20 years. Okay, I went on to other things, including that I'd been hanging out at the cemetery so much that Forest Hills hired me to write their history and guidebook. But a friend of mine, I'd been working for years in collaboration with the Boston Women's Heritage Trail. And my old friend Mary Smoyer, who may well be here tonight, asked me if I would give it was every March, everybody wants lectures about women. And she said, hey, would you give a lecture about Susan Dimock for the Jamaica Plain Historical Society in March? And I said, Mary, I haven't talked about Susan Dimock in 20 years. It's so long ago that the last time I gave a lecture, I used slides. And my good buddy Mary said, and some of you have heard this story, Susan, aren't you going to have knee surgery soon? And I said, yes. She said, you're going to be laying in bed for 3 weeks. What better do you have to do than to make this into a new lecture and make it into a PowerPoint? So I did it. There was a snowstorm that night. We did it in the at the Loring Greenaw House in JP. It was snowing. I was on crutches and drugs. And I came in and gave this lecture to a standing room only crowd, and a bunch of people said, we want to buy the book. And I did a little research the next day. Basically, I said, I don't have a book. And I was convinced that okay, if nobody's done this, I guess I have to do this. I mean, I need to. And so I applied to the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University and applied with this as a project to do on the side of my regular work. So I was still being a photographer and a writer and doing other things, writing other books too. But I worked on this for 7 years, and then it got published, and here it is today. So I'm thrilled, and I'm thrilled to reconnect with you, Jackie. That's so cool.
Thank you. There has so much history gets lost, and for you to be able to keep Susan Dimock alive and give her agency and the respect that she's due is a great service, not just to women and the future women in this country, but to the whole country. So thank you for doing that. And along the way, you did some wonderful, you had some wonderful trips. Tell me about the trip to North Carolina and then the trip to Europe.
Okay. Well, North Carolina was the first no-brainer. So my first fall at the Women's Studies Research Center, I decided, okay, she grew up in a town called Washington, North Carolina, often confused with Washington, D.C. because it's Washington, N.C. as opposed to D.C. But it was the first Washington in the United States. And it's up the Pamlico River, and a seafaring area that boats and trade were really important when Susan was there. She was born in 1847, so she's there in the antebellum period. And I thought, okay, I've got to go there. And I know that lots of people do lots of research online, that digital things are just extraordinary today. And I do that, but I really like to be in the place. And I think I discovered that by being at the Dimock Center and being in the same building as Susan by being at the Forest Hills and being there by her grave, knowing she's there for eternity. And I wanted to be there and to look around, see where she used to live, see what the people were like, work with local archivists, local librarians. And I got a fabulous welcome and spent a week there, or almost a week there, I guess. And they had just had a hurricane, and half the town was partially flooded. And in fact, getting there from the airport, there were so many detours because of the flooding. But I met some amazing people, and I think when you're traveling, it's really important to stay in touch with the people you meet, the librarians, the archivists, the other historians. And one amazing story that came out of that, the librarian at the time was a woman named Claudia Dolan. And so we just kept going back and forth. I would send her stuff, she would send me stuff. And maybe a year after I visited there, because again, this was a 7-year project I worked on, um, she called me or maybe emailed me and said, Susan, I've found something that I think would interest you. And I went, okay, what is it? And she said, well, someone just donated to the library their family Bible, which is really old. And I was, accessing it and writing down the numbers, and a piece of paper fell out of it. And it was a church newsletter, and it had a story about from 1858 about little Susie Dimock and her friends who were going on a seaside expedition, and one of the little girls named Jenny got a toothache, and little Susie Dimock said, "Oh, my aunt said that the pillontary root is really good for toothache." So she went out and scavenged for pillontary root, brought it back, and rubbed it on the little girl's tooth to make it feel better, and then sat with her all night until she felt better the next morning. Okay, so this is little 11-year-old Susan Dimock
She was
being a
already.
doctor already. But the story, I couldn't have researched that story. It was a church newsletter that fell out of a Bible, so it was an example of stay connected. This woman remembered me a year later and sent this to me, and it's invaluable. It was just invaluable. So, and what was very sweet is when the book came out, I've stayed in touch with the people in North Carolina, and they flew me down for a week and set up 7 or 8 different events, from large lectures to book signings to walking tours, that I did this past January. And we're still in touch with, they're fabulous people down there, and we have a mutual admiration society. So,
What's the nearest big city to
um,
Washington?
well, it's
Where did you have to fly into?
um, yes, I should remember this. When I came in
It's not
January,
important. I was just curious.
I
Because I
think the
don't
one
know
I
that
flew
area.
into in January was Greenville, but I think Raleigh-Durham was the big one, which is a couple of hours away. Yeah, but it's a small town. I mean, it's a population today of 10,000. When Susan was there, was a population of like 3,000. So it's not a big town.
Very small. Very
But
small.
you
And
asked
then
about,
the
yeah.
story of you taking the ship over, and I
Well,
know we're skipping a lot of Susan's story, but I just think the audience should hear that, because I want them to read your book. It's amazing.
okay, thank you. Actually, there are 3 trips to Europe that I'll kind of combine. The most recent one was, Susan, I hate to, I've already told you she died, okay, and I already told you she died in a shipwreck. After 3 years of being the resident physician and running her own private practice downtown, and founding a nursing school and doing all the surgeries and teaching and all this, she was burned to a crisp.
Can I just insert for the audience, Mary Elijah Mahoney, who was the first African-American trained nurse in the United States, trained at the New England Hospital for Women
Right.
and Children.
The New England Hospital had the first professional training school for nurses in the United States, even though MGH often claims that. Not true. And so Susan trained the first professional nurse in the US, Linda Richards, and that same program, 4 years later, Mary Eliza Mahoney became the first professional African American nurse. So it was a very inclusive place. But anyway, so Susan got burned out, and she said, I will come back and work here, but I need a vacation. So she took a transatlantic trip on a liner, the SS Schiller, across the Atlantic. And it was delightful for the first few days, but then it started getting dark, and it started getting foggy and windy and huge waves. They lost control. They didn't know where they were, and they eventually lodged on a rock off the Isles of Scilly, off of Cornwall, and people were just swept away. I think, Olivia, we have an actual image of that. I think Currier and Ives print of the shipwreck. And nope, we keep those coins. I promise to get to them, but no, there's a ship. Yes, there it is. So they got stuck on what was called the Retarier ledges, and basically couldn't get off. And the waves kept getting higher. It was dark. They were having report guns and they were putting up flares, but no one could see them or hear them. And as it turned out, 372 people were on the ship. Only 37 survived, only one of which was a woman. And so here was so there's it was such a big deal that Courier and Ives did make a print of it. But so I needed to know more about this story, and so two things. The most recent, which actually came after the book, but a couple of my old college roommates, I periodically travel with my a couple of two or more of my old college roommates, convinced me to go across on the Queen Mary, and they said, look at it, this is the to go across from we started at Brooklyn and went to Southampton. They said, this is the only part of Susan Dimock's life you haven't replicated. And I said, yeah, but it didn't end well for her. But anyway, I did that in May, and it was pretty amazing to take the same trip, albeit the Queen Mary 2 is very well equipped for things like this. But the other thing,
how long did it take you to get over?
It was the same amount of time. It's basically a week. Yeah, it's basically a week to get from one side to the other. But what I did do also was, and this was a flying trip, is I wanted to go to the Isles of Scilly and I wanted to see the site. I wanted to find out about the shipwreck culture there, of which this shipwreck was a part. And also I wanted to see, if possible, and even visit the site where her ship had sunk. And so we went to the Isles of Scilly and I met a variety of people there. What's neat is that a lot of the buildings are just like they were 150 years ago, old stone buildings and harbor and whatever. And I learned that it really, kind of like Cape Cod used to be, it's a place where there have been a heck of a lot of shipwrecks. And they know for sure that in the past 300 years, there have been at least 700 different shipwrecks off of the Isles of Scilly. So it's a nice place to pass by, and there's a great, a Bishop Rock Lighthouse, and if you're traveling safely, you like to see Bishop Rock Lighthouse. In fact, when we were going over on the Queen Mary, I remember the captain saying, by the way, you can't quite see it in the fog, but over to the north of this is Bishop Rock Lighthouse, which everyone wants to see as they're approaching the English Channel. So anyway, I wanted to see this and visit it. And at Brandeis, one of the great things they gave me was student assistance. They have a student scholar partner program. And one of my student assistants discovered that there were divers there, including a diver, well, it turned out being two divers who had actually dived for SS Schiller. And I met and interviewed both of these divers to find out more about it. And one of the things I asked these guys is, okay, 700 shipwrecks. I am so lucky that you guys dived for Schiller. Why? I mean, excited. And I said, why? And it turns out, okay, let's look at those coins picture again. It turns out that in addition to the passengers, there were all kinds of things that were taken on the ship, like 250 mail bags, farm machinery, all kinds of equipment. But also there were 30 barrels of gold coins that were being shipped from New York to Paris. It was a banking thing. 29 of those barrels were intact, and divers eventually got them. But the 30th barrel cracked, and all the coins fell out. And so divers have been diving for my ship ever since. So I lucked out. These are a couple of the gold coins that Todd Stevens, one of the divers I talked to, found. He did not give me any. However, he was so taken by my research and my interest in it that he did give me, if we can get back to me, Olivia, he did give me this. It's really heavy. It's a brass newel post for a brass bed. So on the four corners of the brass bed, these would be obviously in first class, or what they called at the time first saloon. These would be in the sides of that. And we know, in fact, he pulled this off the Schiller, and he gave this to me as a gift, and it's really precious. And it's so heavy. A friend of mine picked it up and said, No wonder the ship sank. But no, I mean they were being facetious, of course, but it's a treasure, and it's from SS Schiller, Susan's ship. So so that was an amazing trip. Meeting those people, learning about the shipwrecks, actually seeing Bishop Rock Lighthouse. The diver was going to take us out to the actual site. His ideal was he was going to take me out, do a dive right there in real time, and take me something off the Schiller, which is battered. There's very little left. It's not like Titanic where there's still lots of the ship visible. It really is just fragments. But every day the tides were too bad, and he said, "You know what? Don't want you to replicate this. We're not going to go out there unless it's safe." And the whole week it was not safe to go out to that area. So so I never went to the site, but I saw I could see it from a distance.
Mhm. Yes,
So that's one of the really awesome trips that I took in basically trailing her life.
yes. Wow. What a fantastic journey. We can almost make a movie out of the journey you've been on
There's that.
to bring what was an extraordinary life because she was a young woman. Think about how young she was.
She was only she was yeah, she was started running the hospital because she'd already graduated from medical school and all, came back, was running the hospital as resident physician and chief surgeon at the age of 25. When she died, she had just turned 28 2 weeks earlier.
It's
So
amazing.
yeah.
Wow, how brave she was. And, what a visionary. What an incredible visionary.
One of the things I did is I dedicated to the book to the women who persisted, and uh, which of course is something that we're seeing today. Um,
Mhm.
I can't help think of Susan when I watch the DNC and all the extraordinary women who have been crashing through these glass ceilings, and Susan was one of them.
And when you think about women's health, look at the issues we are dealing with today.
Yes,
She was concerned about women and
right.
giving women access to health. And it didn't matter. She served low income immigrant women
Yep.
as well as, and you said she had a private office downtown. I'm assuming those were women who could who could afford to pay.
That was quite true of most doctors in the 19th century. Hospitals were actually made specifically for people who couldn't afford, who weren't wealthy enough to have doctors come to their home and serve them there. And so hospitals, many doctors did what she did, which was to work in the hospital for free or very, very little, and then make a bunch of money to balance that from their private clients. I must tell you about her salary. When she was the resident physician, chief surgeon, her salary was $300 a year.
Oh,
Now,
wow.
it's different than today, okay, of course. And she got to live at the hospital, so that was free, and she got to eat at the hospital because that was free. But it's still the lowest paid. I did some research on this. The lowest paid school teacher in the city of Boston at that time made $600 a year.
Wow.
And I'm the house historian at the Parker House. The chief chef at the Parker House that same year was paid $5,000 a year.
Wow. Oh my
Oh, and
goodness.
so was that was the same salary as the mayor of Boston. So she's saving lives. Not that chefs aren't important or mayors, of course they are, but it gives you
That's
an idea.
amazing.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
And did I get this right? New England Hospital was one of the first, or if not the first hospital to actually create maternity wards for women to have their babies in the hospital.
They were they were the first hospital in Boston, and as we know, there are lots of Boston hospitals, although there continue to be lots, but that had obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics under the same roof. So to have all of that, but they also had there was another hospital that dealt specifically with women, and that was Boston Lying In. Lying in, by the way,
Yes.
lying in was a term that meant maternity. Because back in those days, you ready for this? Back in those days, it was normal for a woman who was having a child, who was giving birth, to stay in the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks after giving birth. I'm sorry, what is it today? A day?
The
2 days?
day.
Yeah. So that's where the term
48
lying,
hours sometimes if you.
that's where the term lying in came. So there was Boston Lying In who were doing the same thing. The difference was Boston Lying In was run by male doctors for female patients, okay? When Dr. Zach created the New England Hospital, she specifically wanted women treating women because she thought that women could understand women's problems, women's illnesses, things that were specific to women much better. And there was a period when, during the early years of the New England Hospital, where Boston Lying In had to close and closed for 15 years
Ooh,
because they couldn't contain one of the worst, the most dreaded diseases to come into maternity wards, which was called puerperal fever, Puerperal, also known as childbirth fever.
ooh.
And this was spread um, by germs. Of course, germ theory was in its infancy and nobody quite understood it. It hadn't been proven. And so nobody really knew we're saying the word germs or anything. But it turned out that many of the doctors in a lot of the other hospitals were moving from dissecting a cadaver to delivering a baby and didn't change their clothes or wash their hands. And so it
Wow.
turned out that the doctors were
It was
actually,
spreading the germs.
yeah. And so because Boston Lying In, every single hospital had it, and the New England Hospital had it too, but they contained it better than anyone else. And they never had to close, unlike Boston Lying In. So, and one of the things that Dr. Zach had brought with her back from Europe and that Susan studied when she was studying in Zurich, because she went to the University of Zurich when Harvard turned her down, was the importance of cleanliness. So they didn't really know about sepsis, they didn't know about germs, but they did know that sanitation
Mattered.
meant that their patients were doing better than in all the other hospitals. Yeah.
Incredible, incredible. That's quite quite an accomplishment. Uh, so let's go back a little bit to thinking about implications for the future and today.
Sure.
You know, how did you feel when you finished the book and the very first book reading you gave, book presentation? Where was it, and how did you feel afterwards? And how are you feeling today?
Well,
Uh,
you were there, Jackie.
was that the first one?
That was the first one,
Oh,
yes.
was it? I didn't realize
Yes.
that. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So it was November of, yeah, so it was last November, and our very first event was appropriately my friend Gretchen Grosier from the JP Historical Society, which you may remember was the place that I gave the snowstorm lecture in 2015. They hosted it at Forest Hill Cemetery. So it was a perfect everything coming together. You
I had no
agreed.
idea that was the very first one.
Yep, that was our first event. Yes. So it was wonderful because it was the JP Historical Society. It was you. It was at Forest Hill Cemetery.
Oh,
Um,
wonderful.
we packed the place. It was standing room only. It was lovely, and and you and I had this great conversation. Yeah.
As we're having a great one tonight. So, what if you could think about just what you'd like to see as a result of this book, thinking about Susan, and what would you like people to, how do you want them to feel? What do you want them to take away from your 7+ years of work? Now more than, if you count all of it going back to the early days, you've been a part of Susan's life for 3 decades
Yeah.
plus,
Yeah.
or she's been a part of your life for three
Exactly.
decades.
Exactly. I think, I mean, the fact that I said that I dedicated to the women who persisted, I think the fact we didn't get into all the various roadblocks that she went through, that the walls that she walked into and went, I'm going ahead anyway. I always imagined that if she was alive today, she'd be wearing one of those Nike t-shirts that say, just do it, because people kept saying, you can't, and she kept saying, I will. and she just kept moving ahead, moving ahead, moving ahead, despite all the roadblocks, including little things like that. Her supportive dad died when she was a kid. Her town burned down during the Civil War. Her home burned down. She was rejected by Harvard. She just had just all these different things happen, and she kept moving ahead. So I think that inspiring and continuing to inspire women to move ahead, believe in yourself, and follow your dreams, no matter what someone says. And in her particular case, and this happens today, it's no, you can't because you're a woman. And that kind of inspiration to keep on fighting for what you believe in and don't think that because you are something, you can't be something. So I think that's what I want to come away with. And I hope that, I do hope that people who know people in schools and colleges and medical schools tell them about the book because I write very accessibly. There's a shocking amount. I have something like 500 footnotes and hundreds of sources, and it's intricately, I mean, it's very well researched and it's chock full of information, but it does read very easily.
Like a novel. It just you just want to go to the next page. You become a part of Susan Dimock, just reading your beautifully written narrative.
Thanks. Anyway, so I hope that more and more kids of all ages, kids, adults, everyone, read it and get inspired to do something that other people say you can't do that. And you say, yeah, I'm gonna though.
I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna
So
do it.
I'm wondering, it looks like it's almost 7:15, so I'm wondering, Jackie, if we should turn this over to Olivia and any questions. Or is there something or is there something else we should talk about before we open it up?
Olivia?
Something went wrong.
Oops. Oh,
Sure, we
wait.
have some questions. Let's see. Somebody is asking, let's see, Edward is asking, how did Susan pick Zurich to study, and how did she and her family afford it?
Aha, good question. The way they picked Zurich was that all of the really high quality medical schools in the United States, the prestigious ones, were men only. It wasn't just Harvard. And they wanted her to go to a prestigious school. And they learned that in Zurich, they were having an experiment. And the very high quality medical college, which, by the way, turned out to be infinitely better than any of the medical colleges in the United States. In the 19th century, Europe in general was ahead of the US in healthcare and medicine. That flipped in the 20th century, but at that time. And there was an experiment, and they were going to try to admit women and put them on a completely equal basis with men. So they did admit 7 women. Susan was one of them, one from Russia, one from Scotland, one from Wales, one from Switzerland, and they became known internationally in the medical community as the Zurich Seven. And what was great is that each one of these women went back after studying, fitting in. It turned out it was just fine. Everybody was worried, well, men shouldn't mix with women, all this. And it turned out to be fine. And everybody respected and got along with everybody. And each of the women went back to their respective countries and essentially became medical rock stars. Not only became very prestigious physicians, but also helped other women come into medicine, either by starting other schools for women and whatever. In the case of Susan, the way she afforded it was her friends at the hospital who thought she was so smart and so talented. Among other things, we didn't even mention that as a kid, she hung out with the family doctor in her town of Washington, North Carolina, and he essentially let her go on house calls with him when she was 11, 12, 13 years old. And she learned Latin so that she could study the texts at the time. So she blew everybody away. And so they collected money and sent her over there. Also, her mom went back to work. Her mom, who was a widow by then, teaching and selling things, doing all kinds of things, and would send excess money to Susan because everyone believed in her. When Susan came back, she was such a responsible person that She worked at the hospital and did all those things we talked about there, teaching surgeries, resident physician, but she had her downtown practice. She paid back all the loans that people had given her within 2.5 years.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Well,
Other
we have
questions?
another question from Nancy, who's asking, why do you think Dr. Dimock returned to Boston to practice?
She had to. The arrangement was that her friends, because a lot of many of the people who gave her the money was Dr. Zach, Dr. Sewell, the women doctors at the hospital. They said, "You're going to get such amazing training there that you will be probably the best trained woman doctor in America when you come back." This is knowing her capability and what she'd come in with, and knowing what an extraordinary school that was. And therefore, our deal is when you come back, we want you to be the
Pay
resident.
back, pay it forward.
Exactly. So she,
And Sewell came from a wealthy family, as I understand
yes,
it.
yes, yes, because there is a Sewell building
Yeah.
at the Dimock Center, because both she and her dad contributed greatly to the New England Hospital. Right. So yeah, she paid back all those loans.
National Health Service Corps, there's a program where you can get your medical school essentially free, but you have to give back, 4 years community service, working in a community health center or a low income neighborhood, that kind of thing. So that was a version of it.
Exactly.
Probably the first version of it.
Yep. Okay, any other
We
questions?
also have questions. Mary Beth is asking, did Susan know Elizabeth Blackwell? And maybe I'm curious if you can expand this to some of the other women doctors that were in her circle.
Sure. So here's the connection. The Blackwell sisters in New York. By the way, Janice Nomura has an amazing book called The Doctors Blackwell. I highly recommend that. It is about the two sisters who created the first hospital in the United States by women for women, and that was back in 1857. The connection is actually through Dr. Zakshevska, Susan's mentor and the head of the New England Hospital. What happened was Dr. Zakshevska, where she was just Marie Zakshevska at the time, was living in Berlin, was a midwife, wanted to be more, but she couldn't. They told her, "Nah, you can't do that, but you're going to have more opportunity if you go to the United States." It actually turned out to be different than that, but that's what they told her. She came to the U.S., did some odd jobs at first, and then connected with the Blackwell sisters, and Marie Zakshevska began working with them at the hospital, even though she was only a midwife. And she did fundraising for them, helped them develop the hospital. And they said, you're so smart and talented, we think you should be an MD as well. And so they arranged there were women who had gotten into the all-male medical schools, and very often it was a backdoor deal where one woman would be let in, be quiet, sit in the back of the room, take your test, but don't bother us. And so they got that for Marie Zakshevska. And so as they were so impressed with her, she went to a place that we now call Western Reserve, and she got her medical degree and came back to work with them. By the way, the guys at Western Reserve were so upset that she was there. She did a wonderful job that when she left, they said, okay, that's it. No more experiments with women. And so for years, they never let women back in. And this happened in many cases where a woman would get in, just one. So anyway, what happened was she became a doctor, but she was sent up to Boston because the Blackwell sisters said, we understand there's a bunch of people in Boston who are very progressive, very liberal, and very rich. We think that you could go up there and get some money for our hospital. But it kind of turned on them because she came up and Boston fell in love with her. And they said, why don't you come live and work here? Yeah, exactly. So what she did first was she worked at there was actually a school for women doctors in Boston called the New England Female Medical School, run by a guy named Samuel Gregory. However, it was it wasn't like Harvard Med, okay? And it was more for training midwives. And she started teaching there, but she was very upset because she didn't think it was high quality enough. That they were training women, but it wasn't high quality enough. And also Samuel Gregory said, well, everyone who comes should graduate. And Marie Zakshevska said, no, they should only graduate if they pass all the tests and are really competent. And he said, when they come out, we should call them doctress. And she said, no, we should call them doctor. So they split. And then she had the idea to create the New England Hospital. So the Blackwells were basically directly spawned Marie Zakshevska creating the second hospital in the United States for them. Now, I don't have any correspondence between Susan and them, but I have to assume that there was a connection because of Dr. Zach and the Blackwell sisters.
Mhm. Interesting.
Interesting. Jim is asking, how did Susan fit in with the other leading Boston feminists of the time?
It was well. The answer was well. Susan was gone from she left. She actually did an internship at the hospital and worked under the other doctors when she was like 18, 19 years old. And she left for medical school in 1868. She came back in 1872. During that period, there was a surge of what shall we call them? Enterprising women, uppity women, women who were decided to be professional, despite the fact that people said there's something wrong with you if you want to be a professional. So when she came back, she was in the midst of all these wonderful supportive women, including Lucy Stone, who in 1870 began the Women's Journal. Lucy Stone, one of the most important suffragists in the United States. And the Women's Journal constantly wrote articles for and supported for and helped doing fundraising things for the New England Hospital. When Susan died, they kept running articles about her and fundraising so that they wanted to have a Susan Dimock free bed at the hospital where someone who applied could get completely free health care no matter how long they stayed there in her name. And they advertised that in the Women's Journal. When Susan left, there was a young writer who was just coming out with her first major novel. And when Susan came back, she was a very, very famous, world famous writer. That would be Louisa May Alcott. And
Wow.
Louisa May Alcott was Dr. Lucy Sewell's second cousin. So they all knew each other. During the period that Susan left, Ellen Swallow, who later known as Ellen Swallow Richards, became the first woman to enter and go to and then finally graduate from MIT. And she became very important in other women coming into MIT and studying practical sciences. So when she came back, she was in the midst of all these strong, independent women, just breaking
Right, just about that.
yeah, breaking through barriers left and right. Yeah.
Sounds like good company.
Oh, it was fabulous.
Michelle, I think we could have time for one more question. I mean, obviously, the book is a project to keep Susan's legacy alive, but Michelle is wondering if you have any other upcoming projects to help keep that legacy alive. Planned.
Well, curiously, you know how people keep saying, this would make a great movie. I personally don't, I don't have any connections to Hollywood. However, I was convinced by a friend of mine who's a documentary filmmaker and another friend of mine who's a still photographer for Hollywood. And I am going to start taking courses at Sundance in screenwriting, and I'm going to try to make this into a screenplay. Have I ever done this? No. But had I ever written a biography? No. So you got to try, and Susan's my inspiration.
And what an inspiration. And I think it would be an incredible story. And it's so important for young women, young people, period, to hear this story and digest it and fall in love with Susan Dimock and her inspiration to just go after what you want
Exactly.
and to
That's
give
very
back.
exciting. So yeah, thank you both of you for a wonderful program, and thank you everyone online for joining us this evening. I left a link in the chat if you're interested in purchasing Susan's book and learning even more there. Of course, we have more events coming up this fall, so you can check out our website for the latest there and learn more information on how to connect with MHS, join our mailing list. So yes, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Susan and Jackie, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Thank you. Good
Thanks.
night, and good night, Susan. And thank you so much. It was incredible. Thanks,
Thanks,
Olivia, for
Jackie. Thanks, Olivia. And thanks, everyone, for coming.